talk to you for a minute about the summer of '66. That's the summer we referred to when all of this confusion occurred. It required a Supreme Court decision, legislative election, something unusual for Georgia. It sort of reminded me of the Bush-Gore situation that happened during the presidential election. But political races in Georgia usually got hotter on the 4th of July. But in 1966, it was much earlier than that. As I mentioned, former Governor Arnold was a candidate as a Roosevelt liberal. Former Governor Ernest Vandiver was a candidate. They both kicked off their campaigns long before the 4th of July. Vandiver was an ally of the Talmadges, Gene Talmadge and Herman Talmadge. And Arnold was an outspoken foe of the Talmadges. He had run against Eugene Talmadge in 1942 and defeated him for governor and served a 4-year term and was a distinguished and successful governor of the state who aspired to higher office and thought at one time that he might be nominated for vice president. It never happened, but he was hopeful that it would. Arnold was pleased that his opponent was Vandiver because he felt that Vandiver was a Talmadge puppet, and therefore he could not only run against Vandiver, but he could run against the Talmadges, which was a mistake that he didn't realize at the time, because the Talmadges built probably the strongest political dynasty that there will ever be in the state of Georgia. Like Carlton, that's right. They were powerful enough to elect just about anybody they wanted to, and did. Vandiver, on the other hand, relished the idea of running against Arnold, because Arnold, despite his record as governor of Georgia, had written a book called The Shore Dimly Seen, in which he beckoned the South and his fellow Georgians to rejoin the Union. That did little to improve his popularity among Georgia voters, but despite that, he was determined to run. He knew that it probably would be an uphill battle. It had been 20 years since he was governor. People had forgotten him. People didn't like him because he was good. People didn't like him because the Talmadges didn't like him. So he realized he had an uphill fight. So he goes out to Hollywood and gets one of his clients, Walt Disney Productions, to create this doll that resembled Governor Vandiver. And he planned to use that doll to ask questions of Vandiver during the campaign, and have the doll answer the questions in the language of Vandiver, his actual voice from news conferences and other activities that he had while he was governor of Georgia. Vandiver, during his administration, was a staunch segregationist, well known for his promise never to allow black children to enter Georgia schools during his campaign back in 1958. And he struggled through an era that saw Georgia's public schools integrated, saw the University of Georgia admit its first 2 black students ever, and presided over the demise of the county unit system, which the Democrats at that time used to nominate their candidates for the general election. Now, in assessing the strength of the various candidates, Maddox, of course, was a diehard segregationist. He had the support of those people. He had support of the Klan. He had the support of states' writers, and he was very strong in the rural areas of the state that identified with him as a working man, as a family man, and as a Christian. That core support of Maddox probably would have voted for Vandiver in a two-man race. Carter was a moderate peanut farmer who could count on strong support in his home area in Middle Georgia. He would also run strong among the state's organized farm voters and urbanites, especially in Atlanta, who liked neither Arnold nor Vandiver nor Maddox. And Carter's votes probably would go to Arnold if he were not in the race. So there are the candidates, four major candidates. But a strange thing happened on May the 18th of that year. Governor Vandiver called a news conference to announce that he would withdraw from the race. At first he gave no reason, but when pressed by reporters, he said that his physician had warned him that the stress of the campaign would take a toll on his heart, which was damaged, as I said, by a heart attack in 1960 when he was governor of the state. But Vandiver didn't tell the reporters during that news conference that he had already been to Washington to tell his mentor, Senator Talmadge, that he wasn't going to run. And during the conversation with Talmadge, he urged the senator to leave his seat in the Senate, come back to Georgia, and enter the governor's race to prevent their old foe, Ellis Arnold, or Lester Maddox from winning the election. And shortly after that, Talmadge called a news conference and said that he had tentatively decided to return to Georgia and to run for governor. Well, naturally, that tentative decision upset a lot of people, including former Governor Sanders, who quickly reacted and informed Talmadge that his position in the Senate was far more valuable to the people of Georgia than being governor. And several of Talmadge's prominent financial supporters, Coca-Cola's Robert Woodruff, Atlanta Attorney John Sibley, urged him to remain in Washington. Even his mother, Miss Mitt Talmadge, told her son that he must stay in Washington because big business people wanted it back. That's a direct quote. Finally, on May 23rd, Talmadge announced that an overwhelming majority of Georgians wanted him to remain as their senator, and he told reporters at his news conference that he would abide by their wishes. So it would be James Gray, friend of the Talmadges, Bostonian, well-educated, Brown University, who owned a newspaper in Albany, Georgia, and a television station, decided to enter the race. So it would be Gray and Maddox for the segregationist votes, and Carter and Arnold fighting for the votes of modern and more liberal thinking Georgians. Both Vandiver and Talmadge desperately wanted to defeat Maddox and Arnold. Vandiver, who was a great friend of James Gray, made the chairman of the Democratic Party, said he would vote for Gray because of his past loyalty and friendship, but he refused to campaign for him because of his heart problem and the knowledge that people would think that if he campaigned openly for any candidate, that his excuse for not running would not be valid. Talmadge, as usual, gave no public indication as to whom he would support, but there was obvious behind-the-scene activities by the Talmadge people to help James Gray. In the election, Maddox outpolled Gray by a substantial margin, and he squeaked by Jimmy Carter into the runoff with Governor Arnold. Arnold got 30% of the vote, which should have been an indication to him. Maddox got 23% of the vote, and Carter 21%. As we discussed earlier, the runoff, second primary, which was 2 weeks later, was very anticlimactic. Maddox thoroughly defeated Arnold. Wasn't close by any means. And many people believe it was because of the crossover Republican voters who believed that it would be easier for their candidate, Mr. Callaway, to defeat Maddox than it would for him to defeat Arnold. But if Maddox was the beneficiary of the crossover vote, he never admitted it. In fact, he never believed it. He thought that was just a rumor put out by his enemies to make his Democratic Party victory look bad. So, you got to the general election. Maddox versus Callaway. Callaway was a very interesting fellow. He was, first of all, rich. Many of you have never heard of Callaway Gardens down here in Columbus. Chipley, Georgia, which they changed the name to Pine Mountain, but it's still Chipley to me. But anyway, Callaway is a very interesting fellow. He was a Democrat who was appointed to the State Board of Regents by Governor Talmadge. But in 1964, he switched parties and ran for Congress and was swept into office on Barry Goldwater's coattail and became the first Republican statewide candidate in gosh knows when. So Maddox versus Callaway. November 8th, 1966. The choice, as I said, was Maddox, Callaway, and a new contender called Right in Georgia, a group of liberals and African Americans who opposed both Maddox and Callaway. And in the very beginning, nobody paid a lot of attention to that organization, but as this campaign progressed, they gained strength, and it became apparent that they could be a factor in the outcome by polling enough votes to keep Maddox or Callaway from winning the race. Both candidates, Callaway and Maddox, were very similar. They shared the same view on the racial issue. They shared the same view on states' rights and the federal government intervention. And so it got down to a question of who was the strongest segregationist. Maddox accused Callaway of hiring off-duty policemen to keep blacks away from the Callaway Garden facilities, and in an attempt to show the minority voters in the state that Callaway too had a record of discrimination beyond the norm. Maddox, as you know, had an encounter at his restaurant with the black students who attempted to integrate. There's an interesting thing there to me in my discussions with Governor Maddox and with the young minister who led the 3 students to the Pickrick on that fateful day to integrate. First, Maddox said that he had agreed to sign a court order integrating his restaurant until he was confronted by his oldest son, who begged him not to sign it and to go ahead and close the restaurant, because his son said, "You owe that to your followers." On the other hand, the young minister, who, when I talked with him, was a Baptist preacher in Houston, Texas, said that Dr. Martin Luther King Sr. found out that those students at the theological seminary there in Atlanta had planned to go to the Pickrick and confront Maddox and integrate it and eat there. And Dr. Martin Luther King Sr., according to this minister, asked them not to do that, saying that that would be playing right into Maddox's hands, and that they would make him a hero, and that one day he would wind up being governor of Georgia, believe it or not. That's what Dr. King told the students. And so they went anyway. And his response to me was, well, we thought Dr. King Sr. was just an old Uncle Tom, and he didn't want us to do this because it didn't comply with his way of dealing with social problems at the time. So they went, and as you know, they were turned away by Maddox brandishing a pistol. They threatened to come back. They told Maddox, "We'll be back in a couple hours, we're going to eat here." They never came back. Instead, they went to the courthouse and they filed a suit against him for whatever, carrying a pistol or firing, aiming a gun at a person or whatever the charge was. And Maddox was tried on that charge and acquitted later that year. So the election was going on, and you had Callaway and you had Maddox. And people go to the polls, they vote. When the returns came in, it showed that Callaway had defeated Maddox narrowly in the number of popular votes, but he did not receive a constitutional majority, so therefore the legislature must elect the governor. And naturally, the next day there were several lawsuits in. Callaway's followers filed suits in state court, federal court, and everywhere else they could in order to prevent Maddox from taking the election to the House of Representatives and the Senate, because they knew that the Democrats rule the state, and there's probably no possible way that they could win. So the first federal court in Atlanta heard the case and said that the election violated the one man, one vote law, and that it was null and void. But the court did not order a new election, nor did it give any suggestions as to how you could remedy the situation. So the state immediately appealed to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that the legislature, in fact, could elect the governor, and that's what it did. It elected Lester Maddox, and he was sworn in the following day. Now, people were actually, I guess, afraid of what might happen on that inauguration day, because here you had a governor who was not that well known by the people, who feared his reaction to situations. So a group of young people, including myself, got together and we composed an inaugural address for Governor Maddox to try to allay some of the fears that people would have in him, and asked him to deliver it at his inauguration, which he did. The key word in that speech was racial harmony. We felt he had to do that because he needed to restore the confidence of Georgia people in their government after that election, and at the after effects of having a governor who might divide even further a state already plagued by racial division. But Maddox's term surprised many people. His administration was free of corruption. His critics discovered a side to him that was quite different from his racial rhetoric. State Senator Julian Bond, for example, once told me that while he was not a fan of Maddox by any means, he said he believed that Maddox genuinely cared for people and their problems regardless of color. And this was the same Julian Bond who challenged Maddox's delegation to the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago that resulted in Maddox and his delegates walking out and refusing to endorse the platform or support the candidate. One interesting thing to me about the Maddox days in office was that Georgia experienced an economic surge during his term that resulted from the groundwork that had been laid by previous governors, Carl Sanders, for example, who rallied behind Maddox and got his friends and business associates to rally behind Maddox and assist him in making the state a target for industrial growth and industrial development. One of the things that we talked about in the hallway was Maddox's promise to humanize government, and he did it with a program he called Little People's Day. Each Wednesday afternoon, Maddox opened his office to everyone, all Georgians who could come by and see their governor, ask him to pardon their son from prison, complain about their welfare payments, curse their local officials, whatever they wanted to say. He sat and listened, and it was a very popular program. In fact, one time, Carlton remembers this, 3 prisoners who had escaped from a Georgia prison came to Little People's Day and turned in their warden. So Maddox got busy on that one, and he investigated the prison and found out that they were right, that the warden wasn't treating them fair. So there were other results, of course, of Maddox's Little People's Day. I remember the second person who came in, the first person who came in Little People's Day was a student at Grady High School. And this student, Maddox was his effervescent self. And he asked the little guy, he said, "Why aren't you in school?" The little boy said, "Well, I cut class." He said, "Well, you shouldn't cut class. Why did you cut class?" He said, "Because I came to see you. I wanted to see you, to get your autograph." The second one, during first Little People's Day, was a lady by the name of Patty White. I don't know, I don't see any smiling faces out there, so I'm sure you must not know who Patty White was. Patty White was a former school teacher who had turned stripper. So she came into the governor's office and she said, "Governor Maddox, I hear you want to do something for education." He said, "Oh, yes, ma'am, I'm going to do a lot for education." She said, "Well, what are you going to do?" So he explained it. And she said, "Let me tell you something, fella." She said, "The best way to help education is to give teachers a raise. And so he said, "Oh, I plan to give the teachers a raise. You must be a teacher." She says, "No, I'm a stripper." And for a man like Maddox, that was quite an experience. Lester Maddox really mellowed while he was governor. He never shed his support of racial separation, or free enterprise, or anti-communism, or Christianity, or morality, as he talked about all the time. But he was not quite as outspoken on those matters as he became more experienced in government, as he was when he first took office. He was very religious. In fact, he held prayer meetings and Bible readings every morning in his office there, and he invited the public, and I went. I'm sure Carlton's been there. I don't know about Kenneth, but he had that every morning, and he was always there, sometimes taking notes. Now, when his term ended in 1970, he was not eligible for re-election. And at first, he considered running his wife, Virginia, for governor, as George Wallace had done in Alabama just a few years earlier. But he changed his mind and decided that he would run for lieutenant governor. His opponent was the incumbent lieutenant governor, former House Speaker George T. Smith, and other candidates. But Maddox won that election very handily, even without a runoff, which was unusual with the number of candidates they had there. He became the first governor to win the office of lieutenant governor. And then began his feud with Jimmy Carter, who was elected governor that year. I had a personal experience with that. I was in the Capitol, and I happened to see, I didn't work there, but I happened to see Governor Maddox on the day after the election. He says, "Come in my office, I want to talk to you." So I sat down with him, and he was telling me about some of the things he wanted to do with Lieutenant Governor's office, and he wanted to become an ambassador for the state and had other plans. But while I was there, his secretary came in and says, "Governor Maddox, a delegation of senators are here to see you." So I said, "Well, here, excuse me, I'll be on my way." He says, "No." He says, "Just go back there and take a seat." Well, just outside the governor's office was a small room that I call it the escape door, where it's the back door where you can get out. But I sat in there, and I heard that conversation. And the conversation between Maddox and the senators went something like this. "Governor Maddox, when you take over, we've got a list of people here who will be committee chairmen and committee members, and they've been approved by Governor Carter, and we wanted you to have them in time, to make the appointments and see to it that the committees are formed and so forth." Well, boy, they shouldn't have done that, because Maddox became furious, not only at Carter, but also at the candidate who was going to run for President Pro Tem of the Senate. I won't mention his name, he didn't get elected, but Maddox decided, well, if they're going to play like that, then I'm going to get an opponent for him. And he did, and the opponent won. So while he was never, ever confident of how to use power, he knew how to fight back. And I think that probably was his greatest asset and his greatest downfall. The Carter-Maddox feud that went on for 4 years probably did more to set this state back than you could ever imagine. In fact, during Governor Carter's last few days, the polls showed that his popularity rating in the state was 25%. And after Maddox left office, of course, he ran for governor 4 years later and was soundly defeated. But he wasn't through. In the 1976 presidential campaign, he was a candidate of the American Independent Party as an opponent of his friend Jimmy Carter, as you recall. He got only 170,000 votes nationwide, while Carter, as you know, won and moved into the White House. Following his defeat, Maddox attempted again the restaurant business and real estate and several other things, but failing health got him. And finally, he became immobilized and passed away in a nursing home several years ago. I also want to tell you that Maddox, the entertainer, and he was a good comic, he was a good performer, took a stab at show business. He had a former dishwasher by the name of Bobby Lee Fears, who toured the country with an act called The Governor and the Dishwasher. They played in such places as New York and Miami and Los Angeles. But finally, they got into a disagreement and they disbanded. Well, to wrap it up, I think that Lester Maddox, as I said, was one of a kind. We'll never have a more colorful governor. We'll never have a better governor. He was extremely successful in what he wanted to do. He was very popular at the time he was governor, and I think he'll go down in history with a good record. Now, are there any questions?
How many terms did he serve in total?
Those days, Georgia governors were confined to a one 4-year term. But you could not succeed yourself, but that did not prevent you from seeking the office another time.
But he never was successful the second attempt?
No, he was defeated. Yes, sir.
Would you like to conjecture what it would be like if Bo Callaway had been elected governor as the only Republican in the whole state of power, and with the Senate against him and the House of Representatives? We've been in for 4 years of deadlock, nothing happening.
Oh, absolutely. Don't you think, Carlton? I couldn't hear. If Callaway had been elected governor, do you think the legislature would have fallen down to him, or would they stood on their own?
It's pretty tough. I don't think he'd have a rough deal about it.
It would have been tough. Yes, ma'am.
As you look back on things, what would you say Governor Maddox's greatest accomplishment would be while he was governor?
Well, I would say there were several. First of all, I would say that his reorganization of the Department of Corrections would be significant. I think his reorganization of the Board of Pardon and Paroles would have been significant. I think his record of industrial development would have been one of his accomplishments. I think his appointments of judges and others was a major accomplishment. If you look at the people who served with him, you will find that they went on to very successful political and business careers. And I won't name them all for you, but they were all very successful, all of his major departments. You know, he learned learned from Senator Talmadge. He once said, you know, in order to be a successful governor, you've got to have a revenue commissioner that will collect the taxes, a road commissioner that can work with local governments in building roads and keeping everybody happy, and a purchasing agent that's honest and purchases like you should. So Maddox took that to heart, and he appointed people in those positions that were very, very good.
Judging from what you had to say about Lester Maddox and George Wallace, the beginning of George Wallace's life, to your knowledge as a professing Christian, Lester Maddox had no remorse or repentance for his attitude toward African Americans?
I'll read to you what he said. I asked him that question.
Because George Wallace did repent.
Yes. I'll answer that question by giving you his response to my question. My question. You're a segregationist and not a racist, I said, echoing a position Maddox has defined over the years. Amen, he quickly responded. You know what I think a segregationist is? Someone who has racial pride and racial integrity that want their races preserved and the races of other people preserved. My segregation includes opposition to amalgamation, which would wipe out the races. My fight at the Pickrick was for the right of private property, the right of free enterprise for every human being in this country. The same position the Supreme Court has taken and all the presidents. The other fundamental question. Deep down in your heart and soul, how do you feel about black people? His response. I feel that they're a part of the human race, and I'm proud of them when they succeed, or white people, or others, when they are productive and law-abiding. And I am opposed to them when they waste their lives and follow the will of a socialistic government that makes failures out of people who otherwise would be producers. Now, that's not repenting, but that's the definition, his definition of his feeling about racial relations.
Well, I believe you and Representative Caldwell can vouch for this too. He brought more black people into state government than probably all the other governors before them put together.
That's true.
He really did. He appointed a lot of black people to positions in government, and he's never received any credit for doing that.
I remember getting a call from the selective service guy, I don't remember his name, who said, hey, we've got a problem here. We're going to be compelled to appoint blacks to selective service boards. And, would you tell the governor? And I said, well, you should tell him. I'll mention it to him, but you should discuss it with him. So when the matter came up, Maddox had no problem at all. He said, sure, go right ahead. They fight like everybody else in the military, so they deserve to be represented on the boards. Yes, sir.
I was a state trooper when he sent Robert Hightower to apply for a state trooper position. Robert Hightower was hired. Robert Hightower served 34 years, retired as a major in state patrol. And any definition you want to give to gentlemen, Robert Hightower meets.
Thank you. Let me tell you about Robert Hightower. During the first few weeks of the Maddox administration, his secretary came into my office and said, Bob, I got some bad news for you. And I said, what's that? He said, the GBI just called, and someone calling from the Atlanta airport has threatened to kill you. Well, that didn't make my day. So, Robert Hightower came over to see me, and he spent a week with me as a shadow bodyguard, you know, and I love it as you. Great guy.
His life alone is a credit to Lester Maddox.
Absolutely, he's a good guy.
You mentioned in the book that about the way Maddox took care of his staff at the restaurant. I think he managed to make a better life for a lot of people.
Well, he
at
did.
this restaurant.
Well, you know, his business was a, you know, that sort of business that gave him an opportunity to hire people who needed jobs who could perform specifically the tasks that were required of him. Had he been a, you know, electrical engineer, he probably could not have. But he was very good with his staff, and they stood up for him. He needed it.
I have heard that Carter used the Wallaceites in this state as his main, one of his support in the 1970 gubernatorial race with Carl Sanders, and that was the reason he won. And after it was over, he disowned them, threw them out. But he reached out to them to give him the majority so he could become governor. Is that true, or is that just conjecture?
Well, my recollection is that he was very much after that vote. And if he based that on Governor Sanders, when he was in office, refused to allow Wallace to speak, maybe it was to the legislature, or to rally down at Jekyll Island. And Carter used that constantly with rural voters, that if he were elected, he would invite George Wallace to speak. I think those were his words.
Did he invite George Wallace to speak?
Never did, that I know of. Yes, sir.
Senator Miller was Lester Maddox's executive secretary, was he not?
He was.
At least at the outset, did he serve the full 4 years?
No. Mr. Maddox first had a executive secretary by the name of Bucky Redwine from Athens, who unfortunately for him was left after a short while. Then he appointed Tommy Irvin as executive secretary. Tommy went to the Department of Agriculture, but Mr. Campbell had to go to Washington. The governor sent him over there. And there's a story there too. I guess I can tell this. It's on me. But he needed Governor Maddox needed an experienced person in that job, because Tommy left there to go to become Commissioner of Agriculture at a very inopportune time. The legislature was in session. Bills were coming down there every day. So he needed somebody experienced that knew about that to sit there until he had time to find, you know, a permanent replacement. So we went to see him, Judge Brooks and I, and Bill Burson went to see the governor and tried to explain to him, you know, you got to have somebody out here tomorrow to take care of all this. And so I suggested that he find somebody in the state government who had been in the House or the Senate. And he told me that he already had promised the job to a gentleman by the name of Mac Barber, who was a member of the legislature. But Mac didn't want to take the job until the legislature adjourned, which was 2 or 3 months later. And so we started, of course, looking for people. We recommended 3 or 4 people to him. There was a fellow in the revenue department in the House. We knew he wanted to retire and would be interested in it. Then there was a state senator, the former state senator that worked over there somewhere. We knew that he was not interested in the job. Then there was a fellow working over there in the Department of Corrections as personnel manager, who had been a state senator, director of the Department of Probation, congressional candidate, very well qualified fellow, college professor. So we recommended Zell Miller to him, and he interviewed Zell. And Zell, you know, said at first that he really wasn't interested in the job for obvious reasons, but he took it because we kept hounding him to go over there and get this done. And he became, for all practical purposes, the governor of the state there for a while. Right, Carlton?
That's right.
What happened to Peter Zach Greer
Gear.
during that time? Gear?
Gear. Peter Zach Gear was probably one of the most promising young politicians this state has ever known. He was very close with the Talmadges. He was a great, good lawyer. He served as executive secretary to Governor Vandiver, and he ran for lieutenant governor and was elected. Served in that capacity for 4 years, at which time he offered for re-election, but was defeated by George T. Smith, who was the outgoing Speaker of the House. He went back to South Georgia, became a very successful defense attorney, prosecuted, special prosecutor for the all-day cases, if you remember those, vicious murder cases in South Georgia. So he just slowly faded from sight politically.
He, in that election with George T., he garnered 49.6%, I believe, of the vote. And they had a runoff, and George T. beat him.
Who was governor then? That was for lieutenant governor?
That was for lieutenant governor.
Who was governor here?
Maddox.
Maddox. And Governor Maddox, he mentioned about corrections. Now, at the time that he took over, it was purely chain gangs. That's all it was. I mean, it was horrible. And I was on the committee at that time. I was on the State Institution Property Committee at that time, but I wasn't on the penal committee, but I went some. It was just devastating. And he said he wanted to do something about it. We started working, and he invited Johnny Cash, came down 3 or 4 times to when they opened the prison. And he was a big supporter of it. Johnny Cash was right down. And he was very fond of me.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned Peter Zach. Wasn't there another politician, Jimmy Bentley, that was
Jimmy Bentley.
great coming up guy?
Jimmy Bentley was a protege of Senator Talmadge. He and Senator Talmadge were very close. Jimmy Bentley served as executive secretary of the Talmadge for a while. Then he went in the insurance business, but later ran for insurance commissioner and was elected. He was one of the party of 5 Democrats who switched parties in 1970. And he ran for governor as a Republican and was defeated by a gentleman by the name of Hal Suit, who was an Atlanta news man, Republican candidate. So Bentley and the switchers, all of the people who switched parties were defeated that year. That was the year Carter was elected. Carter defeated Hal Suit in the general election. Other questions?
You was talking about his relation with the blacks. There's something pretty strange that happened. After he left, he was in not good financial shape. He left the governor's office in worse financial shape than he came in. And the members of the chairman of the House, me and another boy, used to take a collection every year to pay his insurance. We paid his insurance and to keep it going. And he was not eligible for any type of reimbursement as a pension. Guess who introduced the bill give you an opinion. Jose Williams. Jose Williams. Introduce the bill.
Other questions? I'd like to give you a short preview of next week. We have an interesting panel next week. We're going to discuss politics and religion. I think it'll be very interesting. I'm just going to stand here and listen. It's a very intriguing subject to me, and I hope it will be to you. We have on the panel Dr. Fred Craddock, who is nationally known as a minister who runs the Craddock Center down in Cherry Log. We're going to have Dr. John Wells, who is acting president of Young Harris College, and who also is an ordained minister. We're going to have Dr. Chuck Gillespie, who is my preacher. So please come back. I think it'll be very interesting. At least it will be to me. And then following that, as your bulletin says, we will have a session on politics and the media, which I think also will be very interesting. So keep that in mind. I'm sorry about our postponement today, but we will have a session on Senator Talmadge as we did on Senator Russell. We're just going to have to work out the schedule, but we'll let you know. So thanks for coming.
I wanted to Bob to tell you, because some of you may be interested in purchasing a copy of his book about Maddox, Everything's Pickrick. Tell them how this can be secured.
Well, it's published by Mercer Press. You can get it cheaper on eBay or Amazon. I don't sell them, I just write them. But anyway, if you're interested, I'll try to help you.
The title?
Title. Everything is Pickrick. That was Maddox's expression for meaning everything is okay.
I imagine bookstores can order them for you. They may not have them, I don't know.
I think that bookstore over in Bearsville orders like that.
The bookmark.
Book,
How many languages is that printed?
It's, last I heard, it was one.
I was one of his favorite sayings. If you met him on the street, he'd say, "Governor, how are you? It's good to be alive. A lot of people ain't." Please allow me to introduce to you Carlton Colwell. Carlton is a member of the Georgia House of Representatives for more than 30 years. He was president during the administration of Governor Maddox, as well as Governor Maddox's term as Lieutenant Governor of Georgia, which we'll talk about a little later on. I'm delighted to have Carlton here. Our program on Senator Talmadge has merely been postponed. We will have it at another time, and we'll let you know when, as soon as we make it definite. During the course of time that I worked on this book, I met with Governor Maddox for countless hours to talk to him about his life, his family, his background, his philosophy, and his term as governor, lieutenant governor. I needed no convincing because I knew that he was one of a kind. You can't forget a man who rides a bicycle backwards, who whistles bird calls, who runs up escalators as described by Mrs. Franklin, and who aspired to be and became governor of a great state like Georgia. I first became acquainted with Lester Maddox in 1966
during the campaign for governor, which involved some of the state's leading politicians. Ellis Arnold was a candidate. Ernest Vandiver began as a candidate, both former governors. Senator Jimmy Carter was a candidate. Lester Maddox was a candidate, and there were others. But later today, we're going to get into that election, and look at who won, who lost, and what effect it had on the state of Georgia. In the meantime, Carlton and I are just going to reflect on Lester Maddox. And I'll begin by saying, as I said, that I first met Lester Maddox formally in 1966 when he was candidate for governor. I had been to his restaurant, as had many poor working people like me who could get a good home-cooked meal for a good price. So I ate there often, and I knew him casually as a waiter with his coffee pot and that sort of thing. But I sat on a platform at a Democratic Party rally in Eastland, Georgia, representing Senator Carter, whose campaign I managed, and there to speak for him during the rally. And seated next to me, to my right, was Lester Maddox. Shook hands with Mr. Maddox, told him how nice it was to see him, and was really overtaken by his statement that, son, before this is over, you'll be on my side because I'm going to win this thing. Well, of course, Lester Maddox, a candidate with no money, no visible organization of support, nothing that it usually took a candidate to win. Was going to win this thing. So I remembered that. And from that point on, I knew, as a result of that rally, that Lester Maddox was a viable candidate for governor because of how the people reacted to him when he made his speech and outlined his platform, which he called Society of Liberty. Knew then, went back to Atlanta and told Senator Carter, I said, look, Ellis Arnold is not the guy you've got to be. You've got to be Lester Maddox to get into a runoff. So, my first impression of Lester Maddox, and I'm sure Carlton had a first impression.
Well, yeah, I did. I used to live right above him. A cousin of mine, we worked in Atlanta, and we lived up on Hemphill Avenue. We go down to Pickrick and eat. Of course, Governor Maddox was not the best in remembering names. Chief, he called me Chief for about several years. And so the funniest thing happened to me when he got in this runoff, there was 8 members of the General Assembly that endorsed him publicly. And I was one of them, and I went down to see him, went up to the old Henry Grady, and Linda, his daughter, was on the desk there. I said, I want to talk to the governor that was in this runoff, and she said, all right. I said, he's busy right now. I said, can I get your name? I told her my name. I said, now, well, I looked down on the pad, and it's had my tag number on it. I had a representative tag, and so I had that. And I said, Linda, what are you doing with my tag number? She said, where's that? I said, that's my tag number. And she hollered out and says, Dad, we found that man that's running your bumper sticker. So this was one of the first times. And there's he would take us to every year and feed us. We'd go to a dinner with him. There's 8 of us. I can't remember all the names. But we went with him there. I used to go with him and Colonel Sanders. They'd go to S&S cafeteria over there on Beach Street. And he was something else. He was awfully good to me because I got they said, the first $55,000 out of their emergency fund for our school over in Union County. And he gave me that. And what I remember really from him, I thought it was extra special for me. I was the little boy, he was 5.5 years old. And we buried him on Mother's Day. And his mother was ill, and he came to the funeral that day. So I had real fond memories of Governor Maddox.
Of course, the runoff that year, runoff election between Governor Arnold and Mr. Maddox. And following that runoff, the Democratic Party became very afraid that it would lose the election to a gentleman by the name of Callaway, who was the Republican nominee and the first one that had been on the ballot in Georgia since, I guess, called the Civil War. But Maddox was a Democratic nominee, and the Democratic Party was really scared. And so they were looking for every vote they could possibly find. And a group of people came to see Governor Carter, then Senator Carter, and myself to see if we could help patch up the differences between Maddox and Carter and get those voters back out for the Democratic Party. Well, Senator Carter refused to participate, but I agreed to talk to the Carter faithful to see if they would help elect Mr. Maddox, because they want to keep the State House in Democratic hands. Particularly interested in it were Senator Russell and Senator Talmadge, and who looked at it from a patronage standpoint, because as you can well imagine what has happened here in our state since we've gone Republican, they are quick to oust Democratic state workers sympathizer. So they had an interest in the election. The approach was to be that we would hold congressional rallies in an attempt to keep together the congressional delegation, which at that time, except for Mr. Callaway, was Democratic. And big rallies, multi-county rallies, at which we would mention to attendees that, incidentally, Lester Maddox is our candidate for governor, and George T. Smith is our candidate for lieutenant governor. But the election came, and it will always go down in history as one of the wackiest periods that you can ever imagine. And Carlton remembers that. It wound up in the legislature, it went through the courts, the Supreme Court, which upheld the Constitution of Georgia, which said at the time that in the event there was no clear winner in an election, it would be decided by the House of Representatives. You were there.
I was there. I was there that night. Peter Zach Gare presided. He was lieutenant governor at the time. He presided over both houses there, and we was in the House of Representatives, and the vote was taken. And Bob remembers this when we met the number that he had to have. There's a few of us went down to the governor's office, and a lot of people, I guess, of course, Bob remembers he was there, but they swore him in right then, and he was later sworn in out in public, but they swore him in, as you remember that night.
Governor Sanders said to Mr. Maddox, let me back up a minute. On that day, when the legislature was to convene to decide who would be governor, I got a call from Mr. Maddox, and he asked me if I would go to lunch. So he had visited Maddox and I went to lunch. And he was a little bit anxious. So I said, look, the numbers are there, you're going to win, so you've got to prepare yourself to react to being elected governor of Georgia. Yes.
Would you kindly give us a time frame? What year is this?
This is 1966.
Thank you.
The legislature elected him in January of 1967. So this was in January of 1967. I don't remember the specific date, but it was with the legislature convened their first day. So Mr. Maddox, I explained to him that he would go in, the numbers were there, and he needed to be prepared. He had to have some acceptance speech because they would probably wheel him up to the legislature and he'd stand up before all the TV cameras. And he needed to have something to say. So he asked me if I would prepare him a statement, which I did. And it was very simple. As I recall, it said, you know, my heart is full. I'm grateful to the people of Georgia, to the legislature for entrusting me with this great office. I can promise you that I have no friends to favor, no enemies to punish. Just your that normal speech. But the logistics got to be a problem. So I called over to the State Patrol office and I got the State Patrol director to send some plainclothes people up there to pick him up and bring him over to the Capitol, where he stowed away in the state auditor's office until the final vote was taken. And he had won, so he got up and he went upstairs, big crowd. You can't believe the crowd there, like Carlton. There was, you know, masses of people. Goes in, goes to the legislature, they whisked him down to the governor's office. And Carl Sanders, who was the outgoing governor, said, Mr. Maddox, I suggest that you be sworn in immediately because there are going to be lawsuits flying all over the state tomorrow. So I couldn't find a judge or a person qualified to swear him in, but finally got Judge Ward of Dublin to come in. And they swore Mr. Maddox in, and he went home, went to bed, and got up the next morning for his inauguration. The inauguration was a simple ceremony. The state was in turmoil at the time. Normally, when a governor was elected and nominated in Georgia in like July or September, back then, September, you had the months of September, October, November, and December to prepare yourself for your administration. In other words, it was necessary at that time for the governor to get a budget, to get his people in line, so when the day came, the inauguration day came, his administration went to work at that point. But unfortunately for Mr. Maddox, he didn't have that luxury. So he went into office without a budget, without staff, because he had not been assured that he would be governor of the state. But he overcame that handicap and found a good staff. Wouldn't you say, Carlton?
He did.
He had.
Well, that's one thing that I admired about him, because I think the traits of a good leader is to know who to delegate your authority to. And he didn't go in there and try to tear up everything. He left people in positions that knew what they were doing. And of course, we had in the House of Representatives and the Senate vote. Before that, I served 2 years under Governor Sanders, and back to him and all the ones which preceded him, they picked the chairmen of each committee and reviewed the members on that committee. So when Governor Maddox was elected, we got our independence back, and then we elected. We had George T. Smith as Speaker, and so we elected George L. Smith, another Smith, to take over. He was Speaker until he died, and then that's when Mr. Speaker Murphy was elected then.
Well, that's Maddox. Of course, I'm sure would have liked to have had power to make chairman, committee members, run the legislature as previous governors had. But unfortunately, the legislature outfoxed him, declared its independence, and elected its own officers. He didn't get to appoint a speaker like the previous governors had done. He didn't get to appoint a committee chairman like previous governors had done. He didn't get to appoint committee members like previous governors had done. we had a conversation about it. And we said, look, you know, the legislature is independent. I mean, there's nothing you can do about that, so you might as well take credit for it. So he did. In many of his speeches, he prided himself in the fact that he wanted an independent legislature. Back to the swearing in. As I said, I was not a Maddox supporter. I had originally signed on with Governor Vandiver, in whose administration I had worked. He was a good friend. I went through that process, as you know, as you remember, about his great problems with school integration, University of Georgia, the county unit system, all the things that Georgia politicians have promised to preserve over all the years failed during the Vandiver administration. I thought very highly of him and still do. But I had started off as a Vandiver man. Governor Vandiver withdrew from the race because of a heart condition. And Senator Carter decided that he would run. So he asked me if I would handle his campaign. I agreed to do that. I moved temporarily to Atlanta for that purpose and went through the summer helping Jimmy Carter. So Maddox was not my choice in that race. But the more I talked to him and the more I learned about him, the more I believed that he was actually a dual personality. He had his thoughts about racial things and government things and communism and socialism and all that stuff on this side. But on the other side, he was a very humane person. He really cared for people and he cared for their families, and he was really, really a good Christian, hardworking, blue-collar kind of guy who could communicate with blue-collar people in the average Georgian. I think that's why he won, because they could communicate with him. They understood him, he understood them. Whereas the other candidates, Governor Arnold and perhaps Vandiver at that point, was high above that average thinker.
Well, you know, Bob, he's one of the first person I met when I went to the General Assembly. He was down there. Of course, I don't know how many governors he's been speeches for, as far as that goes, but he's been a great friend of mine over the years. I'm just glad that he decided to move to Union County. You know,
because I paid taxes, that's why.
He's having us pay taxes, that's right. But you know, it was, I remember they had I believe at one of the stations they had all of the candidates on there, and they was talking about we was building a mansion was being built. And yeah, so no one had been in the mansion and that it was going to be completed. And all of them was talking about being, you know, I want you to come to the mansion, to the new mansion to see me when I'm elected. And they got down to Governor Maddox and he said, I just want you gentlemen to know that I present you. I'll do my own inviting to come to the mansion because I'm going to be governor.
Yes, ma'am.
Could you give us some of his personal background, Lester Maddox?
Yes, I sure will. I claim to have that. Lester Maddox was born in the Home Park section of Atlanta, which, as many of you probably know, is that section off of 10th Street, just to the east of Georgia Tech campus, near the plant that is known as Atlantic Steel. His father, Dean Maddox, worked at that plant. And the neighborhood, Home Park neighborhood, was composed of people who moved into that area in order to get a job at the plant. And so it was a mill town, so to speak. He was born there, and he grew up there. It was an integrated neighborhood. There were streets of blacks as well as Caucasians. All of them mostly worked at the steel mill. Lester Maddox, as a youth, was a sickly individual. He suffered from some nervous condition that gave him convulsions. And so he was under doctor's care for a long period in his early life. Later on, he learned that he was almost blind and had to get glasses in order to see. And he told me once that changed his whole outlook on life. That he began to understand why they put signs up and what the signs said, because he was never able to see them or understand them. But he was not a very good student. He went through a very poor scholastic career in O'Keefe Grammar School and North Fulton High School. So he dropped out of school in the 10th grade and started working, mainly to help support his family because his father became a serious alcoholic and was not able to provide for the family. So Maddox's business career actually began when he was 16 years old. He had a fruit stand at which he sold various products to the mill workers, operated from his front yard. He was successful with that. He later opened a hot dog stand down on Magnolia Street, where he met his wife, Virginia. Those of you who know Maddox will remember Virginia because he was so devoted to her, and she was such a big part of his life. That's the story of riding the bicycle backwards. He was running his hot dog stand. He saw a pretty little girl named Virginia Cox that was standing over 2 or 3 other girls. And so he decided that he really wanted to capture her heart. So he gets on his bicycle backwards and rides it down Macmillan Street until he hit the curb. And he broke his arm. So that was Virginia's introduction to Lester Maddox. She was quite a person. She refused to marry him until he could bring home a paycheck that was sufficient enough in her judgment to support the family. That took several years. But he was working at Bell Bomber plant at the time, and he finally got a promotion that put him over that level. So they were married and lived there in Home Park to begin with until he bought an upper class home out on Harris Trail in Buckhead. So from there, to answer your question, Maddox got involved with Open Pickrick, got involved with politics, started his column called Pickrick Says, and the Atlanta newspapers became famous. He wrote of political issues and personal opinions, and fried chicken, and his column became so popular that on Saturday mornings, the first thing people read when they picked it up was what his old Maddox got to say today and about who. And so he became famous in Atlanta for that one thing. Are there other questions?
When did he open up the Pickrick?
Well, I mean, gosh, I can't remember that.
Several years before he was.
When was he born? What are his dead dates?
Maddox was 83 years old when he died. I can tell you, he was born on September 30th, 1915. The second child and second son. Pardon me?
I was almost that old. Go ahead.
Yeah, so he was born in 1915. Yes, sir.
Who was in the runoff and why did it have to go to how did the election go to the legislature?
You know, we're going to get into that, but I'll tell you. Georgia had a law that said that the winner of an election must have a constitutional majority, which is 50% of the vote plus one. In the Democratic primary, Maddox was in the runoff with Ellis Arnold, Governor Arnold. He defeated Governor Arnold badly, and thus became the Democratic nominee who faced Mr. Callaway in the general election that November. And in that general election, there was no winner because although Callaway got the plurality of votes, he did not get a majority. So that brought our Constitution into play. The Constitution says that the General Assembly would elect the governor in the event there was no winner during the election. So that was challenged in the court, went all the way to the Supreme Court, and with a 5-4 decision of that year, the court ruled that the Constitution prevailed and the General Assembly could, in fact, elect the governor. Now, there's one interesting thing about that. Judge Hugo Black, who was a rather liberal member of the court, accepted that ruling by saying that the General Assembly, in his opinion, had the right to elect the governor to begin with. That it did not have to go to people.
Was there a third candidate too?
Pardon?
Was there a third candidate that took votes away?
Yes, yes.
Who was the third candidate?
Well, it wasn't a candidate, it was an organization. It was called Right In Georgia. It was composed of minorities and liberals who didn't want either Callaway or Maddox. If you'll give me just a little time, I'm going to go ahead and all that. We're going to have to take a break here.
Was it county unit system a factor in there?
No. The county unit system went by the wayside in 1961. Or not, yes, 1961, or 62, when it was ruled unconstitutional. And in fact, the 1962 election between Carl Sanders and Marvin Griffin was conducted with popular votes rather than the county unit system. But Sanders would have won the election anyway. He got more county units than Griffin. Another question?
Pickrick was pretty close to the 10 counties.
Right. Right there on MPL.
I remember going there, time or two, and he would be scurrying around in the restaurant. All the textiles enjoyed him.
Yeah.
Because he's cutting up and doing things.
Played his harmonica.
Yeah, doing things.
Sang a song.
I just heard it.
I remember once at a banquet somewhere, he got up and was walking around pouring coffee. And somebody says, this governor, his security man says, "Governor, don't do that. Well, that's beneath the dignity of a governor." He said, "I ain't a governor, I'm a waiter."
At one time, if you ever go to the Capitol, if you look at his picture, it's the only one. He has his wife with him. His wife is in the picture that's hung in the Capitol. And if you look to the left, there's a land Constitution with a fish in it. He called it the fish wrap. But that's in the Capitol now. But if you ever go down there, you need to go down and see it. But he told me one time that, Baldy would write all these, he said, I used to really enjoy all of Baldy's writing and drawing all these pictures of people until I got governor and he started on me.
I'd like to take a minute to, yes, ma'am.
I just want to say that yesterday at the Blairsville restaurant, I was talking to this guy, and he has one of the axe handles from the Pickrick that the governor had signed. I said, "Oh, you've got to bring it here so we can."
Well, if Governor Maddox were here, he would take exception to that phrase, axe handle.
Oh,
Pick handle.
pick handle.
he would quickly correct people. It was not an axe handle, it was a pick handle. And I guess that's because of his Pickrick. I'd like to take just a minute to read to you, if you don't mind, the last interview that I had with Lester Maddox, because it, I think, summarizes his life, his feelings, that happened when he was, I guess, 80 years old. So I'll quickly go through it, but I asked him specific questions. And one of the questions I asked him was, why did you run for governor in 1990? You remember that he ran when Governor Miller and Andrew Young, Roy Barnes, Bubba McDonald, and some very serious candidates ran. And this is what he said. He said, I still had the same thing about wanting open and clean government. Some of the things that happened then really disturbed me. I had observed that in order to pick up $13 million for pork barrel projects in the Senate, they changed financing on bonds from 5 years to 20 years. And just to pick up $13 million, it cost an extra $70 million. They were just going wild with bonded indebtedness. I asked him this: how about George Wallace? He quickly responded with a reply that made it perfectly obvious that the two old friends and political pals were not close when Wallace passed away. If George Wallace came into your living room today, I asked, what would you say to him? Maddox paused to collect his thoughts. I would be friendly and gentlemanly to him, he said, but I would let him know that I was disappointed that he campaigned for anything he didn't believe in. That's what got me campaigning for mayor of Atlanta in 1957. People campaigning one way and living another. I would never have campaigned for anything if that had not happened. Then I asked him this question. Did you know he was a critic of Lyndon Johnson? So I said, suppose Lyndon Johnson walked into the room where we sit. How would you greet him? Lyndon Johnson was nasty, Maddox quickly replied. He wouldn't answer my letters or my telegrams. I'm the only person who ever picketed the White House and became governor. I'm the only person who picketed the Supreme Court and became governor. As you know, over the years, Maddox took to the picket line quite often when he disagreed with people. So I asked him, what would you do if Jimmy Carter came in and sat down in that chair over there? As you know, he and Jimmy Carter were constantly fighting. Carter was governor and he was lieutenant governor. His response was, well, then I said, and what would you say if Jimmy Carter came and sat in that chair over there? Would you shake his hand and say, hello, Mr. President? I would shake his hand and say, hello, Mr. President. Then I would immediately ask him if the emotional trauma he admitted he had during the campaign is the reason he refuses to be honest with the American people. He went on to say several things about Carter that I wish he hadn't said. Maddox said that Carter was angry at him because Carter did not win the governor's election in 1966. This is Maddox. He said the biggest disappointment in his life was when they counted the votes and racist Lester Maddox was governor. He was not. When they counted the votes, Maddox continued, Lester Maddox was governor and Ellis Arnold wasn't. I didn't beat Jimmy Carter. He ran against a former governor, another liberal. You may agree with me, but it's a fact. Two liberals and Ellis Arnold had been governor and were best known. He's the only one who beat Jimmy Carter. When they had the runoff, I didn't beat Jimmy Carter, I beat Ellis Arnold. He said I beat him. He wasn't even in the race. He was beaten by another liberal. So Maddox goes on in this interview to ask him if you could swap lives with any politician who ever lived, who would it be? Truman, Washington, who? Well, he said, me and Truman had a lot in common. We were on our own. We both came from free enterprise and we were free to be our own men. Truman exercised that freedom to a great extent. I liked Eisenhower, he continued. The last Democrat I voted for was Harry Truman. If all the presidents since Eisenhower had started no more programs than he did, then we'd be out of debt. And finally, you look back on his political philosophy with rare pride. I think I've had an unusual life, he said. I was an outsider, and I'm the only governor ever elected lieutenant governor. And I'm really not a Democrat nor a Republican. I'm just Lester Maddox. That's kept me in trouble most all of my life. And that's what I want to be remembered for. Being true or real as I can.
When Maddox was elected governor, had he held any elected office, whatever? He had run for mayor.
He ran twice for mayor of Atlanta, defeated both times. Then he ran for lieutenant governor, and was in a runoff with Peter Zach Gear and Boggs. But the interesting thing to me about his mayor's race was that he got into a runoff with Ivan Allen, which showed much progress over his first race, where he was defeated by Mayor Hartsfield. We've been asked to take a break now, so if we could take a short break and come back, and then we'll go through that election in 1966 and answer in detail some of the questions that you brought up about it.